um, you know, something urgent comes up or you need to go and pick up the kids or whatever it is, that's okay. You're not going to be penalized for that or anything. We will upload a recording of this webinar onto our learning management system, which we'll speak to in a moment as well. And it also just helps if you're struggling with any of the concepts that we go through or any of the content, you've got access to that recorded session so you can revisit any of the information that we've discussed. Of course, we don't want you to just rely on the recorded sessions, and it is very valuable to be here in a live session because you will be able to ask any questions and also be able to see the questions asked by other participants and just get involved through the chat. So, strongly encourage you to still attend live. And we've got Kathy joining us here as program moderator. Kathy, how are you? Tell me a bit
I'm
about yourself.
good. I'm good. I've had a haircut since that photo. Thanks,
Yeah.
Max. Yes, so I look after the training here at Safe System Solutions, and I've been in the road related technical training space for coming on to 20 years, which is always a good reminder of just how you're getting on in age. But I will be your program moderator, so I'll be looking at things behind the scenes, moderating the chat, asking, feeding those questions through to Max throughout the session. If you've got any technical difficulties, I'm your person there as well. Um, so there's the chat function. You can raise your hand. You can use the Q&A. If all that fails, you can send me an email. There's you would have received a number of reminder emails from our training team, so you can yeah, perfect. Thank you, Max. And yeah, and sometimes you can even text me. It's crazy. There's so many options. So that's available to you. And I think that's about it from me.
Nice and easy. Thank you very much, Kathy. Few more introductions. So myself, my name is Max McCardle. I'm active transport lead at Safe Systems Solutions. I started my career in transport at Vic Roads, or DTP as it's called now, as a graduate engineer, and have spent yeah, a bit of my professional life out on sites. So actually in construction of different transport projects, and moved to the consultancy side about 5 years ago to join Safe System Solutions and have been heavily involved in active transport projects throughout my career, but certainly with a focus at Safe System Solutions, and thinking about cycling safety and what are kind of best practice treatments. So keep abreast of industry standards as well as what's going on in practice internationally as well. So by all means, if you've got any tricky or complex scenarios that you want to have a chat through, I'm all ears and happy to provide in any advice I can. The content that we will be going through is peer reviewed by our principal engineer, Ken Beer. That's also another old photo because he's got a wonderful mustache now. Um, so Ken Beer is the principal engineer of Safe Systems Solutions, has 20 plus years of training and road safety experience. And just to ensure that all the content that we're developed and presenting as part of these sessions, Ken's kind of done that technical assurance check to make sure that it's in line with current practices. So between us, if you do have any challenging questions, I think we'll be able to help you out. Otherwise, we'll certainly be able to put you on the right path. Now, I did touch on before our learning management system, or the LMS. You should have received an email for this already and should have already had a go at signing in. It's very important that you do have access to that platform because that is where all of our assignments and quizzes and resources are shared. So it's critical to be able to have successful completion of this course, to be registered and have access to that LMS. So if you're having any troubles getting online, um, please let the training team know and they'll be able to help you out with any of those requests. But great to see in the chat that we've already got some registered there. And I'll go through at the end of today's session exactly what the LMS looks like and all the different kind of functionalities of it. Now, one of the things that we do like to really encourage as part of our online sessions is this idea of engagement. We don't want to just be talking and used as a bit of background noise or things like that. We do want participants to really focus on the next 2 hours as we go through this module and I guess continue with this presentation throughout its completion. So in order to kind of activate that engagement, what we've done is we've hidden this little fellow in the slide. So this is Wally, Wally the Wombat. And what we're going to get you to do is throughout today's session, just keep a tally of how many times you spot Wally. This one is not included in the count. So you should currently be on 0. Oh, I've got a hand up.
Oh, no, it was an accident.
Oh, no problem.
You just ignore me.
Okay, no worries. Well, welcome. Lovely to have you on board.
Yep.
So yeah, just be part of the content for today. We'll be randomly popping in Wally, so make sure that you keep an eye out for Wally. We do have some minimum benchmark requirements for successful completion of this course. And one of them is we do require all participants to attend all the webinars or view any that are not attended in a live format. So as I mentioned, if you've got a doctor's appointment or whatever and you have to miss a session, that's okay. Just make sure that you do watch the recorded session. We need to have seen satisfactory completion of all set tasks. After each session, I'll be explicit about what the set tasks are, but it could be quizzes or exercises or assignments. We also have a site visit right at the end as well. So we do have a little bit of coursework to complete as part of this. And we've set a minimum pass mark of 80%. 80% is quite high, but the reason that we've kind of set that at that level is because the content that we will be teaching, it's not going to be the intricate, detailed design details, that someone with 15 years experience would be required to know in order to actually progress a cycling design. It is very, very much talking about the key concepts, identifying risk for cycling safety and trying to mitigate those risks. So we feel confident with the course content not being too complex that we would expect to see lots of failures. And also we enable every participant up to 3 attempts with their coursework. So if in the first instance you're not meeting that 80%, we do provide feedback. So we'll give you some information, some tips of how to improve that. If you're still struggling with any of the concepts or the coursework is a bit confusing to you, we can then organize one-on-one coaching. So please do reach out if you are struggling and you're up to the second attempt and you're not too sure that you're going to get the pass. Just drop us a line and we'll be happy to either do an MS Teams call or a Zoom or just a phone call, whatever works for you, because we would be failing as trainers if we are unable to see our participants completing the coursework successfully. So please do keep that in mind if you're struggling at all. To get the day started, we do have a poll. So, Kathy, if you wouldn't mind launching the first poll of the day, hopefully you can see that jump up on your screen. It says, please rate your level of cycling infrastructure knowledge. And there's 4 options: very knowledgeable, knowledgeable, aware but don't know much, and not aware. I'll give you a bit of time to complete that. You're not marked on this poll at all, so it's completely anonymous and things like that. It's purely just for us to get a bit of an understanding of participants' current skill levels. You can also move that little poll window around if it's blocking the screen and stuff like that.
Thanks, Max. We've got everyone has completed that.
Oh, that was great. Awesome. Okay, so we've got most people aware but don't know much, and also knowledgeable. So none of the two extremes, very much in the middle of the bell-shaped curve there, which is very good. Hopefully we'll be able to get more and more people up to the pointy end of that bell curve. Anyway, today's discussion is all going to be on off-road cycling facilities. And generally what we're talking about here are things like shared paths. So if, you were completely designing a transport network from scratch, you would definitely consider off-road cycling connections as being the gold standard. It is absolutely the safest infrastructure treatment out there because you don't have to interact with vehicles. You don't have to worry about that at all. You've got your own separate facility. So good place to start in terms of best practice is, well, what can we do if we are designing for shared paths or off-road facilities? What can we do to further enhance those designs? So a few points that we will be discussing is what type of path width should we be adopting? How the gradient of the path can play into the level of safety. Some common hazards that we do find on shared paths. We'll discuss sightlines and go through some calculations that we can perform. And we'll also have a chat through fencing. Now, eventually our shared paths do cross over roads. So it's not just an unlimited shared path network. There will be instances where they do interact with the road corridor. So we'll also have a chat about, well, what can we do to manage those conflict points with vehicle traffic? We'll talk about cyclist priority treatments, have a good discussion around bollards and the risks that bollards do pose, and also just make mention of the DDA requirements. So that's Disability Discrimination Act. So people with disabilities, they have equal access to the public realm, and just make sure that we are not at all inhibiting their ability for safe movement. The final little sub-chapter of today's discussion will be around where shared paths cross over other shared paths, and we'll have a discussion around the wayfinding signage and also managing cyclist speeds at those conflict points as well. So bit of content to get through, and I strongly encourage just keep the questions coming through as I'm talking about it, rather than wait for the end or wait for me to pause or anything like that. It's just an easier way to go about things. Well, so our first little photo that I've got here is an example, actually not of a shared path. It's two separated facilities. So in case you're not familiar, this is in Melbourne at the Docklands. And where we've got the bike riders there, that is a dedicated cycling facility. As you can see, it's off the road, well and truly away from the roadway. And it's exclusively used by bicycle riders. The pedestrian area is much closer to the waterfront and away from the cycling area. The reason that this approach has been adopted in this instance is because this cycling corridor is what's referred to as a strategic cycling corridor. It's basically a cycling highway. It's a very, very important route for bicycle riders. It takes them into the heart of the city, and it has a lot of cycling traffic. But there are also significant pedestrian numbers as well, because this is a relative tourist area, depending on who you ask. And there are lots of pedestrians that do come along here and amble along the boardwalk and just, meander along this area as well. So you've got these two kind of high volumes of users. And rather than try and push them together and force them to share one area, you've got them separated in space, as we've got in this example. So a big fan of this, where you do have high volumes of vulnerable road users. So vulnerable road users is just pedestrians and bike riders, cyclists. Where you've got high volumes of both, aim to separate them rather than try and share them, because it's not going to be a comfortable experience for either user if you've got bike riders kind of weaving in and out of pedestrians, or pedestrians, they may not feel comfortable walking through there if there's just lots and lots of cycling traffic. A figure here that we've included that helps to provide evidence for that kind of philosophy. It's taken out of the Austroads Guide to Road Design, Part 6A. Just to note that whenever we do reference any of our figures or tables, even Google Map references, we do include the source link at the bottom, just in case you do need to double check what we're saying or understand the full context. You, by all means, can do that assessment. So what we've got here along the y-axis of this graph is the number of pedestrians two-way per peak hour. So just how many pedestrians you've got in the area that you're looking at during the peak. And along the x-axis is the number of cyclists two-way per peak hour. Just going to focus on the extreme ends of this graph. So if we're looking at the highest pedestrian and also the highest cyclist numbers, you can see that we're at the top right-hand side of this graph. And what's being recommended is a 4-meter wide bike path and a 4-meter wide footpath. So it's suggesting that we shouldn't be delivering shared paths. It's not an appropriate solution because we've got high volumes of both of those users. Instead, let's aim for 2 separate facilities and yeah, go with that approach instead. You can see the really common 3-meter wide shared path. It's really only appropriate when you've got relatively low volumes of pedestrians per peak hour, so around the 100 or so and less. But anything more than that, then you've got that uncomfortable environment and pedestrians may not feel safe, or it may not be comfortable to walk through there or ride through there. Another way that we can gauge what width we should be adopting for a shared path. So the previous one was based on if we know anticipated pedestrian and cyclist volumes, or we can forecast that, or we can estimate it. However, that data is usually very, very rare to have, particularly if you're working in like a greenfield site. If it's a new development, you may be uncertain exactly how many pedestrians and bike riders would be using these type of facilities. You can go with the approach of actually doing some calculations and estimating those things and, trying to plan for the future and thinking about exactly what type of numbers would be expected. But it's also quite common to refer to these tables, which splits your shared paths into these 3 types of classifications. One is called a local access path, which is shown on the left-hand side here. And the way that I kind of think of this one is, I think of all of these, it's similar to your road use hierarchy. So a local access path is similar to like a local street. You're not expecting lots and lots of pedestrians or bike riders. It's not going to be a high strategic function for bike riding through there, but it might connect to local residents and local streets and things like that. And in these scenarios where you do have that lower strategic function, you could look to adopt a desirable minimum width of around 2.5 meters. You can see that a minimum width of 2 meters is nominated there, but it is with the caveat that that is a very narrow space. So in this diagram here, that's about 2 meter wide there. It's important to make note of, though, if you are doing a 2 meter wide shared path or any width for that matter, are there any obstacles adjacent that shared path that make it narrower? So the fact that we've got the fencing and the fact that we've got the utility pole and the signpost there, that actually squeezes up that space even more. So you're no longer looking at a 2 meter wide path. Bike riders would need to basically ride very, very close to that center line. So it's narrowed even further. So certainly be mindful that you can't just go straight for the minimum widths. You need to have a think about what is pragmatic and how will that be actually used by both pedestrians, people in wheelchairs, mobility scooters, and people riding as well.
Just a
Kathy.
question. Thanks, Max. We're making the assumption here that 3.5 is the entire width of the path, not 3.5 meters for pedestrians and 3.5 for cyclists.
Great question. So yes, you are correct with that assumption. The 3.5 meter width is referring to the total width of the shared path. So not two different paths, just one shared path for pedestrians and bike riders.
Both directions. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Good clarification. Now, these two categories, regional path and recreational path, this is where things get quite cloudy. There's quite a nebulous definition in the Austroads guide. A regional path is expected to have that higher strategic function. So you would expect to see, higher volumes, and also riders traveling at higher speeds as well. So it could be a key route from the train station to the central business district or something like that. And so you'd expect wider paths. The differentiating factor to the recreational path is there could also be adjacent land use associated with the path that you're looking at. For instance, there could be playgrounds or schools or activity hubs adjacent the actual path that you're looking at, where people may want to be more inclined to stop, just spend more time there. So you'd have an even higher influx and there could be lots and lots of crossing points. But generally, those two, regional and recreational path, they're not incredibly well defined. And there is a bit of cloudiness around which you would apply depending on what your network looks like or what you hope the aspiration looks like. As a rule of thumb, though, that 3 meter wide shared path is a pretty common standard to have. 3.5 is in areas where you've got, much more activity that is expected. Okay, I'll have a chat now about our gradients for shared paths. So gradient is just the slope of the shared path, how steep it is. And Austroads has these two thresholds for determining what is acceptable. So the dotted line that we can see on the graph is an acceptable gradient, and the solid line is desirable. And the way that we read this graph is on the y-axis, we've got the length of the gradient. So how far do I need to ride up a steep section? And along the x-axis, it's, well, how steep is that section? So just as an example to pick one, let's say I was at a 10% grade, and that is incredibly steep. Like a 10% grade is, you would definitely feel that on your calves if you were walking or riding up that. You would want to limit that. It would be desirable to limit that around 10 meters or so. It's acceptable, however, to bring it to about 25 meters, roughly. So that's just reading those different curves there. But anything more than that, what you're actually going to do is you're probably going to get riders not using that or looking for alternative routes because it's unrealistic to expect them to be able to actually ride such a steep incline for so long. Of course, there's some riders out there that actively seek out these steep ascents, and they'd be very excited to see 10% gradients or 15% gradients. But with shared paths, a good principle to kind of have floating around in the back of your mind is trying to design for those aged between 8 and 80. So not just trying to think of, one super confident, super skilled, super fit bike rider, but all demographics within that age 8 to 80 kind of area. So think of a young child, if they're going to be able to push their bike up such a steep incline, or, maybe a grandparent or something like that, trying to get up something that's super, super steep. That's a good design philosophy to have if you are working in this space. I've included this little snapshot out on site. So this was a few years ago where I conducted a road safety audit, even though it was a cycling project, at this location. And although we've got some literature around what are the kind of maximum and desirable levels for uphill gradients, it's important to reflect if we are talking about shared paths, they are two-way. And so we'll also have riders going down those ramps as well. So in this photograph here, what we've got is an overpass structure. So the shared path goes from one side of the highway, it's grade separated, and then, finds its way to the other side of the highway. Don't have to interact with any of those cars. So that's pretty exciting. However, what we do have is we've got this, ramp that brings us back down to, essentially the verge level or the footpath level, whatever you want to call it. All of this would be to standard and things like that. It's a bit difficult to see in the left-hand photo, but you've got, actually, I might try and draw it as a kind of elevation view. You've got a ramp down and then a flat section and then a ramp down and a flat section. That one is a bit exaggerated. But the idea behind that is for those people in wheelchairs and things like that, those flat sections just enable a little bit of a place to stop, and you're not going to, get to pick up too much speed, or if you need to rest, you've got that ability to do that. So that's what those are for. But the reason that we've included this as part of this, so out there with my auditor hat on and thinking about the potential risks at this site, and you can see in the right-hand side photo, there is a junction or an intersection. So there's another shared path that connects right basically at the toe of this ramp. But if you are at the top of this structure and you're heading down, you can't see that intersection at all. It's completely blocked by the parapet or the fencing kind of cladding that you've got going on there. So not a great scenario here. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is because due to the gradients, we are going to be able to pick up substantial speed traveling down there. You do not need to have to even pedal or anything like that. If you just let gravity take you down, you'd be quite comfortably at 30 kilometers per hour by the time you reach the bottom of that ramp. So it's quite easy to pick up substantial speeds on this facility, and it's it's poor placement to have an intersection or a conflict point there that you can't see, and also where you've got those high speeds. So as part of this audit, there was a recommendation to, ideally just move this path connection where it is a bit more visible. It's not only more visible, but by the time you actually get to that point, you would have washed off a lot of speed because it starts to go back uphill again. And that one has actually been installed since this audit has been completed, which is pretty exciting. But just an example of where you should be thinking about, the uphill ramifications, how steep the hill, the gradient of the path is, but also for users going down, what's the implications of potentially fast speed going down your shared paths? I've got here an operating width or cycling envelope, whatever you'd like to call it, of a bike rider. And there are actually a few different revisions of this. So whether you are from a particular part of Australia or New Zealand, or you're referencing a national standard, this one that we've got showcased here is out of Bicycle New South Wales. There's slight tweaks in between them, but they're more or less saying the same thing. So the operating width of a bicycle and a rider is around 1 meter. And for those not familiar with the operating width, it's basically how much space should we suggest is like the typical bike rider. Now, we do have bike riders and cycling facilities, bicycles that are much bigger, much wider. They could be lower to the ground, like recumbent bicycles, or they could be like tricycles where they're going to have, 2 wheels on the back and they're going to be much wider. So this is very, very much an average. And yeah, it's not going to say that every single bike will fit this. Anyway, operating width of about 1 meter, a head clearance of 200 mil. So the reason that that becomes important is if you've got any shared parts that are going underneath structures, could be going underneath bridges or through culverts or things like that, that's where that head clearance will come in. You need to be able to reference just to ensure that you're not going to get, people clipping their helmet on these things. The other important dimension here is this kind of clearance to hazards. So clearance from walls, poles, fences, bollards, 0.5 meter, that is definitely the standard. Most jurisdictions will just accept 0.5 meter. The 0.2 meter minimum that's referenced there, that would only be really appropriate if it's something that's very smooth, something that's not likely to destabilize a bike rider. And there are examples of that, which we'll show in a few slides' time, but generally you want to keep hazards at least 0.5 meter away from the edge of the operating width of the bicycle rider. The other thing that we have included here is just some, I guess, conventional speeds that you'd be expecting for different demographics of riders. So for those, it's referred to as recreational cyclists. I'd probably use the term commuter, commuter or exercise, bike riders. They could very well be traveling at speeds of 30 kilometers per hour or above. Those, transporting goods or having leisurely rides between 10 and 20 kilometers per hour, and children and families, more ambling along less than 10. So there is certainly a bit of a speed variation associated with different cycling demographics. And yeah, it's important to reflect that. I also wanted to make a note that this operating width of 1 meter, it's basically with the idea that it's a nice flat passage. If you've got a shared path that's uphill, once again, it's actually very, very common for riders to kind of wobble their bike, move the handlebars left and right to be able to pick up speed or maintain speed. And in those scenarios, if you've got an uphill shared path, it might be worth actually making it even wider, because to account for that kind of movement and not trying to narrow the space down too much. Kathy.
Thank you, Max. That's some very interesting information there. Oops, sorry about that. We've had a question that's come through based on the image clearance here. Should the clearance under structures be 2.4 meters? And should this apply to developments as well?
So this one is out of Bicycle New South Wales. So that is what they've currently got as their kind of guidelines. However, there are other jurisdictions that opt for a 0.5. I don't know why my pen's going all upset. Half meter head clearance instead. So that would bring it to 2.7 meters. So it would be depending on which jurisdiction you're dialing in from, but it would be certainly pertinent to reflect on your own supplements and standards about what that head clearance looks like. But yes, based on that one, you'd take 2.4.
And the rider height of 2.2 meters, what is that based on?
Good question. So the eye height of the rider is, I suppose, that's where a lot of the calculation comes from. And that is once again assuming a standard or an average bike height, so where the saddle is, and then applying, well, what would be an average height for a human being, and then kind of working it out from there. So it's by no means representative of the, the diversity of bike riders that we have. It is an average, but I suppose just like with any other operating widths that we have, so we've got operating widths for passenger vehicles, operating widths for heavy vehicles, their exact widths also differ, but we also just tend to adopt a standard or a notional kind of width or height in this instance.
Terrific. Thank you. Thanks for keep the questions coming through. They're great. And if you don't have any, that gives me more opportunity to ask some. So Max will much prefer yours.
I'm happy with yours, Kathy. Maybe we can make whatever happens.
Careful what you wish for, Max.
Alrighty, I'll keep going through. So I just wanted to chat through some common hazards that we do find associated with shared paths. One of them on the left-hand side is furniture, or in this case, bins. And I think this is just a bit of an oversight that we didn't put the bin and the post kind of on the outside of the shared path and not just placing the pole on the shared path itself. That would have been an ideal scenario. So having a think about, any different types of furniture that could exist. So could be fire hydrants that are raised, or utility poles that we've got another example of. The middle one that we've got here is a drop off. So the way that this commonly occurs, if you're out there on site and you're actually building a shared path, you would shutter up to prepare for your concrete, put some timber boards down at the edge of this shared path, pour your concrete, rip all the boards away, and then there should be a final step there of just making sure that you're battering up to the top of the surface. Doesn't always happen, and we do have lots of instances where we've got this this drop off. It's not a significant drop off for the most part. Like, it's the thickness of the concrete, so it's 125 mil or whatever. But if you are, on a commuter bike with very, very narrow tires like mine is there, and you come off the path at that location, you are very unlikely to be able to rejoin that path, because that is a significant drop off for those with small wheels. If you've got a mountain bike, not as much of an issue. But certainly the advice that we, have seen time and time again, when we come across this risk, is just ensuring that you're battering up to the surface. So just filling all of this. I could create a little embankment, just so that you've eliminated that drop-off risk. Another common hazard that we do have is utility poles, very, very close to the edge of the shared path. You might remember in the previous slide, I was talking about the rule of thumb, which is keep all hazards half meter away from the operating width of the bike rider. When you get into these scenarios, it can be a bit I suppose, subjective as to, well, where is the operating width of the bike rider in particular? Like, is it over here? Or is it over there? How do you actually define that? And the other rule of thumb that I'll give to you is you take the edge of the shared path as the edge of the operating width for your bike rider. Makes it a lot easier because now if you've got any fixed hazard, which is half a meter away from the edge of your shared path, you could classify that as a hazard and something that should be looked at to, mitigate that risk. Some potential solutions here. I mean, in a perfect world, you'd just absolutely remove the hazard altogether. You would hopefully relocate the pole so that it's outside of that half-meter clearance, or you would, make an underground asset so you don't have a pole altogether, but appreciate you don't always have the luxury of that. Other things that you could do, you could shift the path out a bit and build it up on that side to maintain the width. Or if you're unable to maintain the width on that side, you could still narrow the path and use some pavement marking or something like that just to try and get riders away from the edge of the path there to reduce that as a risk. I think in this scenario, because you've got the vegetation that blocks the sight to that hazard, and there's a bit of a curve there as well, all of those things kind of increase the risk of riders, clipping their handlebars on that. So even trimming the vegetation and things like that would help to reduce that as a risk. I've got an example of, what that could potentially look like. So this is a shared path adjacent a highway that was constructed a few years ago now. And we've got this gantry column. So it's just a big steel column post. Unable to maintain the width of the shared path at this location. So they've used a little bit of line marking and also flexible hazard markers or flexible bollards there, just to make it really obvious that, okay, the shared path is narrowing because we've got this fixed hazard here. Once again, it's that same idea where it's much, much better to remove the hazard altogether than try and highlight the hazard. But it's important to be pragmatic about these types of things. It is unfortunate that, like, as I mentioned, this was only constructed a few years ago, and this kind of detail wasn't picked up in a road safety audit or things like that. It certainly wouldn't have been impossible to have, constructed this into the embankment and just construct some retaining walls to house that gantry system and then maintain the shared path width. So by all means, if you're doing things at a design stage, it's a lot easier to try and rectify those risks then through design solutions, as opposed to try and mitigate it through things like signs or lines or hazard markers, stuff like that. All right, so wanted to have a quick chat about our sightline calculations, and appreciate not everyone here would be involved in completing these sightline checks. But I just wanted to make a note that there are sightline calculations specifically for bike riders. So it's not a dissimilar equation to, stopping sight distance or safe intersection sight distance. It's really not that different. There's just a few different ways that the coefficient is calculated and things like that. But generally, very, very similar in principle. So what we're looking at here is we've got sightline requirements for both the horizontal nature of a curve. So basically, if you were riding around a bend, can you see what's on the other side of that bend? Or is there going to be things blocking your vision? And to be able to calculate, well, what is the required stopping sight distance? So that is, how far as a bike rider do I need to be able to see in order to, if there is a hazard on the shared path, I can stop before colliding with that hazard. So we need to have a think about, well, what's the likely speed that's going through there? What's the friction coefficient? It will depend obviously on the pavement conditions. So if you're on a gravel track, that would differ to if you're on a nice concrete path. It'll also make a difference what direction of travel you are if there is a grade. So if you're going downhill or if you're going uphill, that will make a difference as well. The other time that we will do a sightline check will be for vertical geometry. So that's where you've got like a crest in the shared path. And it's a similar idea where we want to make sure that we've got enough sights over that crest so that if there is a hazard on the shared path, I'm not going to just ride straight into it and have no idea. I've got the ability to stop. So that's where that second equation comes in. The good news is neither of these kind of quite technical calculations will feature in your quiz. So you don't need to get too hung up if it's been a while since you've done any hectic calculations, but just wanted to make a reference for those that are involved in technical design that there are specific calculations for cycling sightlines. So just to show that diagrammatically, the stopping sight distance for the horizontal kind of curve that we've got here. So we've got a bike rider traveling around the curve. There's an object or a hazard. It could be, a tree that's fallen over. It could be lots of glass that's broken there or something like that, or it could be someone that's fallen over. You want to create these clear line of sight so that you're not going to just ride around the bend and then collide directly with that hazard. So that's what the calculation is used for. Thought I'd give you an example of one of these, where I've actually used this equation. So this is another audit that I completed of a shared path. This is actually bitumen. So it is like a relatively good surface. I know it doesn't look like it there. It looks like loose gravel, but that is a bound bitumen product. So you could be traveling relatively fast. And because we've got this vegetation that's grown and grown over the years, you could see that, I can't really see what's going on around the bend there. So the recommendation is, just to do a bit of trimming to open up our sight lines so that I can see around that bend. Of course, if you were doing something during a design review, you'd be saying, is there a type of plant that we can install here that is by nature low growing? So it's not going to get that big and we don't need to worry about that maintenance. So just an example of how that is actually applied in the real world. I'll move on now to fencing, because there's generally a bit of apprehension around applying fences for shared paths, or a bit of a struggling to understand exactly when and where not to install fences. Because if they're installed too close to a shared path and they're not adequately protected, by all means, they are a hazard. So it's important to get these things right. And the Austroads Guide does have some pretty good guidance on when we should be installing these things. I'll do a shout out to Queensland as well, TMR. They have got a quite detailed report or guidelines document that goes into much more detail than this about what type of fence is required and what the fence should look like and things like that. So if you're working in Queensland, good news for you. You can definitely reference that. But this is certainly what most of us would be looking at. So what we're looking at is there's two scenarios where we could be providing a fence. In the left-hand example, we've got an example of a vertical drop. So, where there's just a sheer face at the edge of the path. Or we might be putting a fence where we've got a steep embankment. I'll focus on the left-hand side first and chat through the vertical drop. And the first note that we have is a fence is not required where X, and X is the distance from the edge of the shared path to where the drop is. If X is less than 2 and Y is less than 250 mil, we're saying a fence is not required with the caveat that we should be battering off the surface. So what that means is it's similar to that photo I showed before where we had the concrete shared path and it was just a drop off. We shouldn't be putting a fence for those scenarios. We should just be filling that area in and creating a bit of an embankment. That's a better solution than a fence. So that's the first kind of little description there. Then we get into these two tiers of fencing, and I kind of wonder if this was the best approach because it kind of overcomplicates the fencing process. But anyway, I'll chat you through it so that you can understand it, and I'll let you make up your own mind as to if this is the best way to go about things. There's this idea of a partial barrier fence, which you could call, I suppose, the silver standard, and then a full barrier fence, which is the gold standard. And it's saying if you've got a drop off that's between 250 mil and 2 meters, so a 2 meter drop off is massive, then partial barrier fence, let's pop that one in. And if it's greater than 2 meters, you should be doing a full barrier fence. I'll show you exactly what those two different fence types look like in a moment. But it's just got those clear definitions of when you would do either a partial or a full. It's a similar approach for our embankment. We don't require a fence where we've got quite flat embankments. That is kind of self-explanatory. Fence not required. And the way that you read it is it's the relationship of 1 to Z, or rise over run, 1 to Z. And if it's between 1 to 5 away, like hinge points, and Z is greater than 3, it's relatively flat, then we don't need a fence. But if it's less than 1, then it has to be even flatter than 8. Don't get too caught up if that's a bit too technical, but it's just that idea of basically what does that slope look like? Is it like a 45-degree or is it like a 10%? You can then do a similar kind of calculation to determine, well, I know what my 1 to Z is. I know what type of embankment that we've got or that we will be constructing. And I know that I'm going to have to install a partial barrier fence or a full barrier fence. So very, very similar. You just got to work out which kind of tier it fits into. Now, the two different fence types look like this. So the top one is an example of a partial barrier fence. And all that it is it's got openings in it. So you can see that there are spaces in between the vertical members where you could pass through. A full barrier fence is just installed with vertical members consistently throughout, where it's physically impossible to fit any human through that space. Those are the two tiers difference. I think it's overcomplicated things, but that's how things are, kind of demarcated within the current guidance. Teaching this course a few months ago, I did learn of a participant who said that, their toddler fell through the gaps of one of these things riding through the partial barrier fence. So I would tend to be a bit more conservative and tend to look at designs that advocate for full barrier fences because it's kind of it's I wouldn't say negligible cost difference, but it's I think there's not a lot of cost saving or benefit in just always going for a partial, where you still do have a risk of those lower to the ground and those smaller potentially falling through, or hazards falling through and things like that. Anyway, just wanted to share that. The other important thing to note as part of these designs is this idea of having a smooth rail. So you can see in the two sections, we've got a smooth rail and we've got a smooth deflection rail. And that is also shown on the photos there. And those are deliberately installed at the heights of between a bike rider's wrist and their shoulder. So if you were kind of straying from the path, you are going to be colliding with this smooth rail at that kind of height, and it maximizes your chance of being able to stay on the bike and not getting snagged on any kind of, like, I don't know, cyclone fencing or anything like that, which has got lots of little different pockets and things like that. So having a smooth rail that kind of juts out is generally seen as best practice there as well. Before I get too heavily involved in more fencing, I actually might give everyone a bit of a break because I know we've gone through quite a lot of content so far. So I'll give you 4 minutes now just to get up, have a stretch, go and make a cup of tea or a coffee or whatever you'd like to do, get some water, and we will continue this presentation in 4 minutes time. So we'll just pause for a second. We'll continue with today's module. So another thing just on the fencing I wanted to mention, low fences. So if you've got like planter boxes or anything like that, they can also count as a risk, particularly for pedaling strikes. So the kind of anything that's above 200 mil is where you might encounter that pedaling strike. So have a think about if you've got any scenarios like that. We also want to make sure that whatever fence that we're using, doesn't curve towards or have any sharp points or any vertical members that could potentially snag the bicycle rider. All right. I've got a shared path crossing over a road here, but I actually wanted to ask everyone a question. And Kathy, if you don't mind opening up a second poll for today. The question I've got for the group is, do you reckon we should be installing fencing along this shared path? So I'll draw a little diagram of what I mean. Let's say we wanted to put some fencing here. Have a go at that. Remember, you're not marked on this, so there's no pressure. But just based on what we've gone through there, do you reckon you'd be advocating for a fence along this shed?
Interesting question, Max.
Do you know this location, Kathy?
I do. This might have even been one of my photos.
Yeah, this is near your high school. This is your stomping ground.
It is my old stomping ground. It's a very interesting one, I guess, if there's any Melbourneites in the in the show today, because we've got been recently, they've added stop signs here.
Haven't they always been stop?
It wasn't always a stop.
It was a giveaway.
I don't think it was in anything, actually. Anyway.
Is that one there? Is that I don't know what that is.
Yeah, that is a stop. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'm talking about sort of back in the day.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Nice.
Nice.
But it's, yeah, anyway, it's not part of your question. So what do you think? Would you add fencing here?
Well, we might end the poll there and share our results because it looks like we've got a common consensus that no, we wouldn't be putting fencing here, and I tend to agree. I don't think that this is, we don't have a steep embankment here. We don't have any drop-offs or anything like that. If a rider is straying from the path, they're probably going to ride into some vegetation, which is not the end of the world. You could argue that, that pole might be closer than that half-meter offset, so that could be a hazard. But it's probably a bit of overkill to be installing a fence to protect from that hazard. So generally agree that we're probably wouldn't be putting fencing in these locations. So that's exciting to see. The reason I brought this image up though is because I wanted to talk about how we can manage shared paths when they do cross over roads and what we can do to manage those conflicts. So in this scenario, it is a bit unusual because we've got a shared path in the median. So this is a divided carriageway. And you've got this massive median. You've also got trams that run along here as well for extra complexity. But what is going on is the shared path is at the same grade or at the same level. And if you're a vehicle crossing over here, you're forced to yield. So the priority is given to shared path users, which is very exciting. It makes for a much more connected and attractive route. You not have to kind of stop and give way at every time you cross a road. And the other kind of key benefit that we've got is it's raised up for vehicles. So let's just say a motorist is not paying attention to any of the signs, doesn't see the give way and look out for bike riders and things like that. The fact that you've got vertical deflection there, or you're using like a hump there, that is going to do wonderful things in reducing speeds and also just raising the awareness that there is a crossing point here. So very, very big fan of using raised conflict points where you do have shared paths crossing over roads. Now, it's not always going to be feasible to do that, but certainly if you're looking at local streets, or in this case, you've got like a median opening, I think they're a very, very viable solution. Got a few more scenarios of where this has been installed. So you can install them like on the threshold. So the threshold or like the T of the intersection, or in this case, approaching a roundabout. You can install them so that you've got that kind of continuous grade for the shared path. It's also could be referred to as a continuous footpath where you're not forcing the bike rider to kind of go down onto road level and then go back up. It's just one nice level. Makes it just such a more comfortable ride. And importantly, you are forcing vehicles through there to yield. So you're awarding the priority to bike riders and people walking through there. The photo I've got here on the right, this is from Brisbane, the Bicentennial Bikeway. And it is another example of the raised crossing point, but I'm not as big of a fan of the second example. And I'd like to hear from the chat any reasons why you think that second example, the one on the right, is perhaps not an ideal layout. So can you identify any risks associated with the second one? Give you 20 seconds to have a think through that. And sorry, remind me, Kathy, are we doing prizes as well? We're giving out prizes.
Great minds think alike, Max, because I was just about to ask you the same question. Surely we've got to give away a prize for a good answer here.
I think we're due. We are.
I think we are. We're probably behind, so we better make up for lost time.
And that does explain why you're in such a fun carnival-themed background.
I'm at the circus.
You're at the circus.
Circus.
Yeah, I thought that was The Office.
It is The Office. It's a circus sometimes. I'm the clown. Anyway, what we've got is the giveaway sign might be misinterpreted. Unclear what the arrows refer to. A barrier to separate from the road once it crosses over might be nice. Multiple signs can be confusing. Approach sightlines looking for cars for cyclists is not great. Yeah, you got to do some sort of head movement there that's in my advancing age is going to be difficult. End the bike lane sooner so it's a safer pedestrian crossing.
Right, some good thinking there. I've got to say, I like that you've covered off a lot of risks there. So thanks for contributing. I might give a prize out to the sightline issue in particular, because I think that's a very valid point to make. So let's just put ourselves in the perspective of a bike rider, and you want to maintain momentum. That's kind of a given. It's very difficult to get to this point here and then kind of turn back on yourself and look to see if there's any vehicles there. Now, of course, you do have the right of way legally and you are awarded the priority, but certainly very, very, good practice to make eye contact and ensure that there's no vehicles traveling through there and ignoring all of those signs. So the way that this is set up with that angle crossing, it actually makes it very difficult to be able to make that eye contact. So that angled crossing is just not set up in a way. Whereas in this example, we've got the crossing points and the vehicle traffic basically at perpendicular angles. And closer you can get to perpendicular, you're basically doing your best to be able to maximize your sight lines there. So very well articulated there, and we'll give a prize out there, Kathy.
Thank you.
Now, this is what it actually looks like a little bit closer, and you can see lots of tire marks, lots of skid marks, perhaps indicative of bike riders having to slam on the brakes because there is a vehicle that is not giving way to them. And so they have to quickly avoid a collision, or just like the curve itself is too tight and they've had to quickly throw on the anchors. But you can see that, this kind of setup is just, it doesn't really facilitate those perfect sight lines in between bike riders and vehicles there. It also makes it difficult for vehicles because the vehicles, they may not expect bike riders to be crossing over them at an angle, kind of diagonally. It's just a bit unusual to do that. I'm certainly not trying to detract from this project. So anyone up in Brisbane that perhaps worked on this or is familiar with this site, I just wanted to acknowledge that, yeah, I understand the site conditions and constraints that you're working with, and appreciate that this was probably the best solution that could have been arranged, but it kind of does indicate why perpendicular crossings tend to be more favorable. Alrighty, we'll have a chat now about bollards, because although it's lovely to see those raised crossing points, they're few and far between. And it's much more common where we do have a shared path approaching a road to just whack in some bollards. I just wanted to make note that bollards are hazards. So going back to that definition of hazard that we took before, anything that's half a meter away from the edge of a shared path that's fixed is a hazard. These are installed right in the middle of shared paths, so they certainly meet that definition of being a hazard. Absolutely appreciate that they are, installed to deter vehicle entry or to deter monkey bikes or dirt bikes or things like that. But they also come at the cost of that, 24/7, 365 days a year risk for bike riders. Now, you may be thinking that, well, they're pretty obvious and they're pretty easy to see, and it seems a bit difficult that you would miss that if you're riding on a bike. But the way that these crashes with bollards tend to occur is if you are riding in a pack or there's multiple bike riders ahead of you. The first bike rider would be, very, very likely to see that fixed hazard and, prepare to move around it. But the bike rider behind them, really all they can see is the bike rider in front. And so unless they are, kind of in tandem and really, really focused on copying their movements exactly, it's not uncommon to see that second bike rider strike a bollard. It could be with a handlebar, it could be with their pedal, or it could be, head on. We also know that the reporting of these types of collisions are virtually non-existent. Bike riders are not one to, go to the police and submit a claim for any of these types of injuries. They just kind of pick up their bike and move on, perhaps a bit embarrassed. But they do get struck quite regularly. If we are installing them, there's a few kind of principles that I like to take away. The first is reflecting on the environment. And the middle one that we're looking at there is, do we actually need to have bollards here at all? So the reason that these have been installed, this is already a pedestrian precinct. And there's a shared path in this vicinity that kind of continues along this boardwalk. But the reason that they have been installed is for maintenance vehicles, so that they don't go any further and that they don't, cross over the bridge or anything like that. It's not for general vehicles. It's not for motorbikes accessing the boardwalk or whatever. It's just so those that are picking up rubbish don't go through there, or, whatever it is. I'm not sure that the bollard is the solution there. You could certainly try to administrate those kind of risks out through safe working methods, just ensuring that, this is the line of your work and you can't travel any further. You could also, geofence vehicles as well, just so that if they are working in this area, they cannot travel any further than that line. I'm not sure putting up the bollard is the right approach there. I also think it's very important to make note of, the architecturally designed bollards. Often they are used with the intent to camouflage with the surrounding environment. And that once again serves to only increase the risk of bicycle collisions with them. If they're not easily seen, if they're not delineated well, they blend in with the surrounding. That should be raising, flags for users there.
That's a comment that's come through as well, Max, about
There you go.
the camouflaged bollards. Yeah.
Absolutely. So it was definitely one to avoid there. The one on the right here, these are called banana bars. They're up in Queensland as well. They're just like a squeeze point, but they're no longer employed, no longer installed. In fact, they're ripping them out and replacing them because they just create this awkward, squeeze point where you kind of meet each other in the middle, and then you end up having handlebars kissing instead. So bit of a uniquely Australian treatment there, but unfortunately not a very viable one. Some other bollard treatments that we do look at. So we've certainly got timber bollards or chicane style treatments. So a chicane is like that kind of, path deviation. Chicanes can work quite well. They're certainly going to deter vehicle entry. A motorbike could still get through there, or a monkey bike or whatever. But you do need to be mindful of, if you are designing a chicane treatment, the kind of entry width that you've got there. Because if you've got like cargo bikes, they're quite long. And if it's too narrow a gap, you can actually physically get cargo bikes stuck in that space, and then they can't access the shared path at all. So this one's a relatively, wide one, but if you make it too narrow, then then you do have the risk of larger style bicycles getting stuck there. Another arrangement that has been employed is the use of U-bollards. And so this one's actually in Hobart. And, riding down here and then entering the city centre, it's actually entering kind of a car park vicinity. You've got this kind of just a bollard hazard directly in your travel path. The idea is to raise your awareness, to let you know that you're kind of exiting your shared path and you're entering more of a roadway type of environment. But I think reflecting on that from a principle level, you wouldn't apply a similar treatment to a vehicle lane of traffic. You wouldn't just say your lane's closed, be careful of what you're going through next. It's just not the approach that you would do. And I think we should be similarly wary of just implementing bollards whenever we've got shared paths that cross over a road or are adjacent a road network.
Just a quick
Oh,
question.
yeah, go
Sorry,
for it.
Max. There we go. The banana bollards, are they used to ensure that only one cyclist approaches the junction at a time?
To be honest, I don't know the history of the banana bollards. I just know that they are getting ripped out because of their they weren't kind of achieving the desired result of them. But anyone up in Gold Coast or Brisbane that might have a bit more history on them, maybe they would know about that one. But yeah, I think it's just an alternative to putting the vertical solid fixed object like this. Just went for a different design approach, but it hasn't quite managed to reduce the risk of collisions.
Thank you.
No worries. Just wanted to share this before I stop talking about bollards. So this is actually a bollard that you can see has been struck many, many times. It's around the corner from our office. It's on the Upfield Bike Path shared path. It's a super, super popular bike route. Lots of cycling traffic and people walking as well use this. And we had this fellow a few years ago. His name's Andrew. He rode straight into this, and then council the next day they came out and gave the bollard a bit of a spray paint and put some new tape on it just to freshen things up, make it a bit clearer. However, Andrew, he did suffer injuries when when he collided with that bollard. He had some facial reconstruction as well as broken bones in his wrist. And whilst he was, on the ground and waiting for an ambulance to come and pick him up after this collision occurred, he witnessed two other bike riders hit that same bollard. So we've got a record kind of in our database of, Andrew's collision because he went to hospital. There was a report that was made. But the other bike riders that collided with the same bollard, we do not have a record of. So it's just another example of bollards are frequently hit and underreported. So we don't necessarily know about it, and we should be wary of just installing them and assuming that they're always going to be seen because they can result in injuries, and we may not know about those injuries as well. So the Austroads Guide does provide, I suppose, an alternative, what we could look at instead of bollards. So chicane treatments is one example. The other is something that looks like this. So it's basically like a splitter island, and you're demarcating two directions of travel for your shared path. You're creating kind of a central island. You could be using landscaping there to prevent that motor vehicle entry. And yeah, you can also include things like hold rails just to make it a little bit easier for bike riders to sit and prop and wait for a gap in traffic before crossing over. This is not the exact general arrangement that we're shown in that figure, but it is a similar vein where we've used bollards in the middle of that splitter island, and the splitter island is just grass. It's not like an actual raised median. So the idea behind that is, to hopefully deter vehicles from entering the adjacent bridge. Of course, if you were a vehicle, you can just go around it if you really wanted to. But it's hopefully going to deter that movement, whilst also not just putting bollards in the middle of shared paths. So that's an example of how that could potentially mitigated as a risk and using bollards, but using it in a bit of a sensible way there. The other reason I like to show this example is it's a bit difficult to see, but those bollards are actually solar panels. So on the top, they've got a solar panel, and at nighttime, they light up. So it's not just during the day. At low light conditions, they've got their own light source, and they're able to be seen quite easily. Alrighty. I just wanted to touch on the DDA requirements as I mentioned at the start of today. And if we are looking at doing raised crossings, or we're doing any shared paths that are crossing over a road, it's important that we also acknowledge that the shared paths are for people that may have disabilities. So people with visual impairments or those that are blind, we still do need to be complying with the Disability Discrimination Act. So things like TGSIs may need to be installed, depending on who's got the priority there and things like that. So just wanted to make a note of that we need to be thinking about, I suppose, all the users there, and ensuring that we've got those features for those with disabilities. All right. So shared paths, crossing over shared paths now. So here you can see I've got two different shared paths, and the question that I've got for the group is, well, what do you think is wrong with this photo? So I've got a very confused looking bike rider there. And my question to the group, and you can chuck it in the chat, is why do you think she's confused? What do you think's wrong with this photo? I'll get her out of the way so you can have a good look. I'll give you 20 seconds to have a go at that one.
This is a classic, well, it's not really a classic, but a Y intersection. You
Yeah.
don't see too many Y intersections on the road for good reason.
There is a good reason for it.
Mm-hmm. Are we giving away a prize, Max? I think we should.
I think we should.
Okay, so we've got ambiguous as to who gives way to who. Confused on priority, unclear about who has priority. She's showing the Y shape. Unclear priority. Both legs appear to end up at the same location. Direction is confusing. No wayfinding signs.
Very good. Very good. All correct as well. A very switched on group. I like this. I like this energy. So absolutely, it is very confusing and very ambiguous. And you certainly want to avoid those words when designing for your shared paths, particularly when crossing over other shared paths as well. So just to give you a bit of context with regards to, how could we fix this to make it clearer who's got priority? A better approach would be to assign a thoroughfare or a dominant leg. So let's just say this is what we are assuming is the major thoroughfare. Instead, what you would do is bring this shared path, and ideally you would square it up. It's better to have these things at 90-degree angles, as we spoke about before. So you could just get rid of all of this section. And then this shared path would have a give way or a stop line, and then also a give way or a stop sign. Just so it's unequivocal, this shared path is the major thoroughfare. You have the priority, and if you're coming in from the other side, you need to give way. So it's a very, very good approach to try and square things up as far as possible. And don't be shy to be implementing give way signs and hold lines and things like that. But the other point, and I will give out a prize here, Kathy, for the person that mentioned the wayfinding, because this is a real life Max scenario where I was not familiar with this location at all, and I had no idea where to go. And so I had to get off my bike and get on my phone and, check my GPS. And luckily I had my phone. because I didn't know which path was for me. So having some simple wayfinding there, which says this is the direction to, the shopping center, and this is the direction to the river. It just makes for such a more connected and attractive route. And just it's not necessarily a massive safety concern, but it will certainly improve the overall amenity that you can provide for shared paths. So Austroads recognized this several years ago now that, well, within Australia and New Zealand, we've got a bit of a hodgepodge view on how to provide wayfinding. So perhaps we need to be doing things in a bit more of a harmonized approach. And Austroads actually released a research report diving into what different jurisdictions do for bicycle wayfinding and what's kind of the most important things to take away if you are, designing for wayfinding. I don't think any of it is revolutionary. Nothing's going to be too complex to understand, but it is one of those areas that's actually commonly overlooked. So just important, if you are designing shared paths, just to make it clear where a bike rider is going to be going, what are the kind of destinations that they're looking at, how far is it to those destinations, using consistent colors, using consistent fonts and the way things look and feel, I think it is very, very important. There's one that I can think of, a creek that I used to live near, regularly floods, and there's wayfinding kind of before you get to the low point of the share path to just be like, just to let you know, if the creek is flooded, you should turn around now and instead take this route, because that's kind of the high ground and you'll be okay. But if you keep going, you're gonna get your feet wet. So I think that's another good example of wayfinding signage, thinking of those instances where the shared path may not be available and what the detour looks like. As I said, it's nothing too revolutionary though. So an example here out of Copenhagen, the way that they do things is they have numbers for all their bicycle routes. So if you're on bicycle route number 2, you know that you're going from the train station to the CBD. You don't have to read a word of Danish. You just follow number 2. So very, very strongly recommend using numbers. The right photo is taken out of the Netherlands. They also use a numbers system, but they've also just included some additional distances and some attractions and provided a map at key locations as well, so you can see where you are in the scheme of things. Where we do have shared paths crossing over other shared paths or crossing over pedestrian areas or things like that, it's important that we think about how we can manage our bike rider speeds, because we may not want them to be able to maintain speed where we've got those conflict points. So in a very similar principle to what we did with our vehicle traffic at conflict points, we wanted to, make it clear who's got the priority, and we wanted to reduce speeds in that environment so that the conflict point is well understood and there's a greater compliance with accepting that priority. So I've got this example, which is quite unique. It is City West Station in Perth, and the train station is just up there. And this is one of those, I forget what they're called, but it's like those pedestrian boom gates, whatever it is. And so when the train's going through there, obviously those are all closed up, and you just get this crowd of pedestrians waiting on the other side. As soon as they open up, they're able to cross en masse and they just head up here, and this is a shared path. So they go right up there. Just got this huge kind of influx of pedestrians all at once. Now, what they've done here is rather than riders kind of just travel along, it's just another shared path, they've deliberately made some quite unique changes to the shared path, and it's very, very much linked to how we would manage vehicle speeds. It's very, very based on traffic engineering principles. So they've got a splitter island. Splitter island is like, hey, something's changing. You're approaching an intersection, or your environment's getting narrowed. They have used a contrasting color for the shared path, so they've used green. They've opted for a pavement marking of give way there as well. There's some additional kind of, curb outstands or blisters, whatever you'd like to call them, that's been installed. And there's all these different kind of visual stimulus to be like, you're no longer just riding on a normal shared path. There's something a bit unique about this location, which I think is quite a sensible way to approach it. I'm not a big fan of just using signs and lines and that's it. So you can't just say, pedestrians ahead and then expect to see bike riders' behaviors change. I don't think that's a very good approach. Instead, implementing infrastructure and changing the way the shared path feels, I think is a more suitable way to do that. But another way that you could potentially manage this conflict point is through the use of, I guess, a wombat crossing. I'm going to have to exaggerate this. It's quite a steep gradient there, but it probably wouldn't look like that. But basically creating like a zebra crossing over this section here. And riders, as they approach this, they have a ramp grade. So once again, just making it easier to delineate that space, raise the awareness of the crossing point altogether, and just, trying to highlight that this is a conflict point. I tend to prefer the wombat crossings or the zebra crossings because whenever we see those, I've got those crossings in the wrong direction, sorry. Whenever we see those zebra crossing markings, it's relatively well understood. People see those and they know, okay, this is pedestrian priority. I need to give way. I need to slow down. So I think that they're a good thing to be implementing, even across shared paths or across bike paths, because they are readily understood. The other example that I touched on briefly is, using signs or lines or pavement markings. So this idea of, putting a stencil down and saying, slow down, there's pedestrians crossing here. Like I've seen them used in multiple jurisdictions and I've never seen them being evaluated for their effectiveness. So I suppose this is just subjective, my own opinion, but I don't think that they would offer significant benefit in actually slowing down bike riders, because by the time you read that, you're likely already at the conflict point and you could actually be traveling at speed and therefore you might not read it altogether. So it's one of those things that it may show that you're doing your best to try and reduce that conflict, but I'm not sure it's really going to significantly impact or influence the likelihood of collisions occurring. Alrighty. Before we move on to the LMS and have a chat through the rest of the session, just wanted to finally close out on how we actually end our shared paths. So, just putting up a shared path end sign is obviously not an ideal way to go about things. Really, really important that we are connecting destinations. We are providing that strategic function of shared paths. We are moving bike riders to areas of interest, and we're connecting those key hubs. We're not just not just kind of putting up a sign and saying this is where your journey ends and you don't need to go any further, because that's not how the real world works. And you will get both people walking and people riding that would just use the verge and potentially accessing the carriageway to continue their journey, which is likely not what you want to achieve. So just wanted to shout out that, think about the strategic function of your shared paths as well, and have a think about how you're going to be ending those facilities. Kathy.
Thank you, Max. And thanks everyone for your questions. We've got a comment that's come through, I guess, about another way to slow people down is, what about small speed humps or rumble strips for cyclists?
Great question. So I'm in favor of those treatments. What I'll do is, in our next session, I'll include some slides just as examples of those, so you can get a bit of a picture of how that can look. I think that is a good approach. Invariably, there are areas where we want to slow down bike riders because of pedestrian activity, and I think that if you can use vertical deflection, speed humps, it doesn't have to be like a significant, massive destabilizing type of hump, but something that would slow down a bike rider makes sense. Similarly, rumble strips, particularly if they've got like a little bit of different texture to them, or they've got a slight, like they've been installed slightly proud of the adjacent surface. If you're riding across that, you might get like a little warning in your handlebars, basically. And I think that's another sensible solution to reduce that risk of just traveling through there quickly.
I've got a little anecdote about that in a minute, but what about small wheel devices handle this sort of thing, like scooters and skateboards and so on?
Good point. So I'm certainly not suggesting anything too massively deviating from your existing surface level. So small changes in the deviation there. So you certainly don't want to create any tripping hazards, as an example. And as with regards to the hump, you also don't want to create anything that's going to be overly imposing, or it's going to create such significant speed reductions that you might have the opposite effect and have thrill seekers coming to go and skate on that now, because that's just a new ramp you've installed. So you definitely want to find that balance, and there are ramp grades and things like that provided in the Austroads guides that can help you determine what would be appropriate in those scenarios. But yeah, generally, I don't think that the smaller wheeled users would be too greatly inhibited by the use of those features.
Thank you. So keep the comments and questions coming through. I guess leading on from what you were saying there, Max, about unintended consequences of treatments that we put in that then people utilize in ways we didn't want them to. And an example of that is, there's a shared path here in Melbourne, which is on a bit of a tight corner. And so there was a lot of speed that comes through there with the cyclists. So they have put in a series of rumble strips. I'll see if I can get a photo in the next couple of days before our next session. But there isn't the line in the middle hasn't been rumble stripped.
Oh,
and
okay.
so all the cyclists ride on the line, which makes it a smoother ride for them, but kind of it means they can maintain speed in the middle of the shared path, so probably making it a more dangerous situation.
What a great anecdote. I'd be interested to see the site. Thank you, Kathy.
All right. I'll see what I can do.
Very good. I'll share my screen to the LMS now and go through this, just so everyone feels comfortable with I suppose, this side of the course. So we've got a welcome tab where we've got the links to the webinars, introductions. So if you want to introduce yourself and say hello to the rest of the cohorts, let us know where you're working from and, whether you're a bike rider or you're just interested in cycling infrastructure, just let us know. That'd be great. We've got a resources tab. Course information, just all the agendas and stuff like that. But everything that we reference is provided in the reference documents. So just recommend downloading all of these and saving a local copy of this for yourself, because that's what we'll be going through over the next couple of weeks. So very useful to have that handy. We've also provided this link here, Global Designing Cities Initiative. This is an international resource. We haven't downloaded that and put it in our reference document purely because they like to see, you kind of have to sign up to them, and they like to see who's interested in this resource, what part of the world, I think it's for their marketing or whatever. But they produce some really, really good stuff. Very, very well articulated. All the figures are very well designed and like graphically designed, well presented. So if you're doing any like stakeholder engagement or anything like that, I think that's a very, very good resource. And it also gives you case studies of other parts of the world that are, implementing cycling treatments and things like that. We've also got a tab here for any resources that you use within your jurisdictions that could be useful. So you can share that for everyone to see. So if there's a particular wayfinding guidelines that you use in the Northern Beaches LGA or wherever you are, by all means, you're welcome to share that because others may be interested in hearing from you. But I'll click on module 1 because that's what we're doing today. We've got the presentation, so that's all the slides that I've gone through today. And we've got a VR 360-degree video. And if I click on that one, it's going to take me to a YouTube video. I've got to click on this one again. And the YouTube video is a 360-degree. So if you've never used this before, all it is, it's just like Google Street View where you can click on the screen and then kind of scroll around and you can have a look at the whole environment that's going on behind you. And this is Ken and myself, and we're just having a bit of a chat about the wonderful blue skies and weather that we were having that day, but also about the cycling infrastructure. And we're talking about what's going on in the background behind us. And then as the video progresses, we actually ride through this example and another example later on. So before we have next session, we'll get you to watch this video. If you're watching on your phone, you can actually move your phone around. It's like yeah, it's all tied in with your sensors and things like that. So it's pretty jazzy. Give it a go, and we'll catch up on Thursday and have a bit of a chat around that video. So make sure you get that done before Thursday. And the other bit of work that we'll get you to do is we've got a quiz. So you just click on the module 1 quiz, you click on attempt quiz, and there's 10 questions. We need 80%, so you need to get at least 8 of them right. If you're having any issues with those questions or not sure why you're not getting 100%, drop us an email and we'll be happy to help. Kathy, anything further?
That's marvelous, Max. Thanks for taking everyone through that. Nothing from me. There's sort of 10 minutes left to go that we had allocated to this session. So I think most people should be able to have a look at that 360 footage and also do the quiz in that amount of time. So shouldn't take up too much more of your time. Any other final questions from anyone? We might just give people 30 seconds to type in any final thoughts or queries. But other than that, thank you very much for taking us through that. Love a shared path. My favorite type of cycling infrastructure.
Good stuff, huh? And so tell me, should we arrive early on Thursday, do you think?
Ooh, there's a bit of trivia, do you think? Should we do a bit of
Yes.
trivia?
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't done trivia for a while. I'll need to come up with special cycling trivia too.
Good idea.
Okay. Yes, just a couple minutes. Nothing too dramatic. Yeah, we'll kick off with a bit of trivia next time.
So if you want to start off next module with a prize, log in a couple minutes early. We'll do some trivia questions and then we'll get stuck into the content. But have a go at the quiz, watch the video now, and have a lovely afternoon. Look forward to seeing you on Thursday.
Thanks very much, Max. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.